Pete Best truly hated him, more than anyone. Pete Best was born Randolph Peter Best on November 24, 1941, in Madras, British India, where his father served as a marine engineer during World War II. His mother, Mona Best, was an ambitious and spirited woman who would later play a crucial role in the early development of the Beatles. When the war ended, the Best family relocated to Liverpool, England, where Mona opened the Casbah Coffee Club in the basement of their home on Hayman's Green. This small venue would become an essential launching pad for many young musicians of the late 1950s and early 1960s, including a group of local teenagers who would soon change music history forever. Pete grew up surrounded by rhythm, ambition, and the energy of post-war Liverpool, a city that pulsed with the beat of early rock and roll. Pete's interest in music developed naturally in this creative atmosphere. While attending collegiate grammar school, he began showing an affinity for percussion, often experimenting with makeshift drum kits. His quiet, brooding demeanor contrasted sharply with the more flamboyant personalities around him, yet his determination and cool composure made him stand out. In 1959, when local teenagers John Lennon, Paul McCartney, and George Harrison were forming a group called the Quarrymen, they often played at the Casbah Club. When they later decided to become a full-time rock and roll band, renaming themselves the Silver Beatles and eventually the Beatles, they found themselves in need of a permanent drummer. Pete Best was the natural choice. In August 1960, Pete officially joined the Beatles, solidifying the lineup that would embark on the band's first grueling performance stint in Hamburg, Germany. The Beatles' time in Hamburg became legendary, weeks of all-night performances that shaped their style, stamina, and musical chemistry. Pete's powerful drumming helped drive the band's sound during these formative days. Fans and club owners in Hamburg were captivated by his looks and rhythmic intensity. His thick dark hair and serious expression made him something of a heartthrob among female fans. Musically, he provided the raw beat that carried the Beatles through marathon sessions, earning him respect from his bandmates, at least for a time. However, by 1962, tensions began to rise. Producer George Martin, after auditioning the band, reportedly expressed dissatisfaction with Pete's drumming and suggested using a session drummer for recordings. This, coupled with personal frictions within the group, led to one of the most infamous decisions in music history. On August 16, 1962, Pete was called into manager Brian Epstein's office and was informed that he was being replaced by another drummer, Ringo Starr. The firing devastated Pete. He had been with the band through their toughest early years, helping them refine their stage act and earn their first major opportunities. Yet just as they were on the verge of worldwide fame, he was left behind. In the aftermath, Pete Best endured years of deep emotional struggle. For a time, he avoided public appearances, suffering from depression and disillusionment. However, he gradually rebuilt his life with quiet dignity. He formed other bands, including the Pete Best Band, and later stepped away from music entirely, working for the civil service for many years. Unlike some who might have been consumed by bitterness, Pete handled his fate with remarkable grace. He married Kathy, with whom he raised 2 daughters, and maintained a relatively private life in Liverpool. Over time, the stigma of being the man who was almost a Beatle evolved into a badge of respect. Fans began to see Pete not as a forgotten figure, but as a vital part of the Beatles' foundation. The Beatles Anthology, which was released in 1995, became a monumental moment not only in the history of music, but also in the life of Pete Best. For over 3 decades, Best had lived in the shadow of the Beatles' extraordinary fame, having been dismissed from the band just before they achieved worldwide success. The Anthology project, which included a television documentary, a series of albums, and a detailed book, revisited the band's earliest days and featured some of their original recordings made before Ringo Starr joined. Among these were early demo tracks recorded at Abbey Road Studios and a Decca Records, with Pete Best on drums. When these recordings were officially released as part of the Beatles Anthology 1, Best was legally entitled to royalties because his performances were included. For the first time since his departure in 1962, he received significant financial compensation for his contributions to the band's formative years. This moment was deeply symbolic. Not only did it provide Best with overdue recognition for his role in shaping the early Beatles sound, but it also represented a measure of closure and redemption after years of being portrayed as the man who had missed out on history. Fans around the world celebrated this turn of events, viewing it as justice for a musician who had endured decades of obscurity and speculation. Best himself later admitted that the royalties brought him both financial comfort and emotional satisfaction, as they reaffirmed that his place in Beatles history was genuine and unerasable. In 2008, Pete Best stepped further into the spotlight with the release of his own album, Hayman's Green, which was met with surprising critical approval. The record, credited to the Pete Best Band, showcased a collection of rock songs that blended a modern sound with echoes of 1960s influences, a clear nod to the era in which Best first made his mark. The album's title paid homage to Hayman's Green, the Liverpool area where the Casbah Coffee Club had once stood, the very venue founded by his mother, Mona Best, and the birthplace of the Beatles' earliest performances. The project was a family affair, featuring his younger brother Rogue Best on drums and co-production duties. Critics noted that Hayman's Green reflected not only Pete's musical maturity, but also his reflective outlook on the long and winding path his life had taken since leaving the Beatles. Songs like Come With Me and Dream Me Home displayed emotional depth and craftsmanship, proving that Pete Best was more than just the man before Ringo. The album allowed him to reclaim his identity as an artist on his own terms, independent of the Beatles' legacy yet forever connected to it. Pete Best's romantic journey with Kathy began in 1962, during one of the most exciting and transformative times of his life. It was at a Beatles party held at the legendary Cavern Club in Liverpool, a smoky, pulsating underground venue that had become the heart of the Merseybeat scene, where fate brought them together. The Cavern was packed with energy that night, alive with the rhythm of rock and roll and the laughter of young dreamers who had no idea how much history was being made around them. Amid the chaos of flashing lights, swaying bodies, and the hypnotic beat of the music, Pete noticed a young woman whose joyful spirit and effortless grace stood out to him. Kathy, who worked as a staff member at the local Woolworths store, was dancing freely and happily, completely absorbed in the moment. Pete, still reeling from his own recent departure from the Beatles and navigating a wave of emotions, found himself captivated by her warmth and genuine smile. As the evening went on, Pete couldn't take his eyes off her. There was something sincere and grounding about Kathy, a contrast to the frenzy of fame and the uncertainty that surrounded his career at that time. Summoning his courage, he approached her, and the two began to talk amidst the music and laughter. Their conversation flowed effortlessly, filled with shared humor, curiosity, and the spark of instant connection. Pete later recalled that it wasn't just her beauty that drew him in, but her kindness and unaffected nature, qualities that made him feel seen as the man behind the fame, not just as the former Beatles drummer. For Pete, who had endured the heartbreak of being dismissed from the band he helped form, Kathy represented comfort, understanding, and a fresh start. Their relationship blossomed quickly, built on mutual respect and genuine affection, rather than the flash of celebrity. Kathy was supportive and down-to-earth, grounding Pete as he began rebuilding his life and musical career. She stood by him through moments of reflection and reinvention, helping him regain confidence and purpose after the whirlwind of the Beatles' early years. In 1963, a year after they first met, Pete and Kathy married in a modest but heartfelt ceremony that reflected their shared values: love, family, and resilience over glamour and publicity. The couple's bond proved enduring, a testament to their deep emotional connection and shared determination to live a meaningful life beyond the spotlight. Together, Pete and Kathy built a home rooted in love and stability. Their marriage would be blessed with 2 daughters, both of whom became central to Pete's world. Family life gave him a sense of belonging and peace that fame had never offered. Pete often credited Kathy for being his anchor, the person who helped him find happiness after one of the most public professional setbacks in music history. While others might have been consumed by bitterness or nostalgia, Pete chose to look forward, dedicating himself to his family and music on his own terms. Kathy's quiet strength and unwavering loyalty were instrumental in helping him maintain that positive outlook. When people talk about the early days of the Beatles, there is often a nostalgic sense of camaraderie. 4 young men from Liverpool chasing a dream that would change music history. But behind that shining legend was a storm of personal tension, bruised egos, and painful betrayal. And for Pete Best, the band's original drummer, the deepest wound of all came not from fame slipping through his fingers, but from the man he felt most wronged by, Paul McCartney. Best never hid his feelings about McCartney, and over the years he spoke with an honesty that revealed just how deeply that bitterness ran. In interviews, Pete Best was often asked about his relationship with the other Beatles, particularly with John Lennon, George Harrison, and Paul McCartney. His tone would noticeably change when Paul's name came up. "Out of all of them," Pete once said, "Paul was the one I had the hardest time forgiving." That statement alone carried decades of resentment. Resentment born from what Best saw as McCartney's quiet ambition and calculating nature hidden beneath his polite smile. Pete explained that during their early days, he and Paul were never truly close. "We were never mates the way John and I were," he admitted. "Paul was friendly enough, but there was always something about him, a sort of distance, like he was sizing everyone up." Pete Best had joined the Beatles in 1960, when they were still just another struggling band from Liverpool trying to make a name for themselves in the smoky clubs of Hamburg. He was the one who gave them a solid beat, the one who helped them get their first steady gigs. Fans loved him for his moody good looks, and he became something of a local heartthrob, something Paul McCartney, according to Pete, did not appreciate. "I could feel it," Pete said. "Paul didn't like that some of the girls in the audience were looking at me instead of him." It sounds petty now, but when you're young, jealousy can eat away at friendships. There were also musical differences between them. McCartney was a perfectionist, obsessed with precision and harmony, while Pete had a rougher, more natural style that fit the raw energy of their early performances. "Paul wanted everything polished," Pete recalled, "but the Beatles back then weren't about polish, we were about power. He used to criticize my drumming quietly, behind my back, rather than just telling me what he thought. I found out later that he was one of the ones pushing George Martin to replace me." That revelation, that McCartney had played a role in his dismissal, was something Pete never fully forgave. When Pete Best was abruptly fired from the Beatles in August 1962, just before they recorded their first single for EMI, he was devastated. "It wasn't just losing the band," he said years later, "it was losing the brothers I thought I had. And Paul, out of all of them, felt like the one who really wanted me gone." The official story from manager Brian Epstein was vague, that George Martin didn't think Pete's drumming was strong enough. But over time, stories surfaced suggesting that personal conflicts within the band had played just as big a role. Pete always believed Paul was at the center of that conflict. Paul was ambitious, maybe the most ambitious of all of us. He had this vision of the Beatles being perfect, and in his mind, I didn't fit that vision. After being replaced by Ringo Starr, Pete fell into a deep depression. He struggled to find work and even considered giving up music entirely. Meanwhile, the Beatles rocketed to superstardom. "Watching them on television after that was torture," Pete said, "and when I saw Paul smiling and joking, it felt like a knife in the gut." He had everything I'd lost: fame, fortune, and the band I'd helped build. That bitterness festered for years. While he eventually found peace and built a quiet life for himself, Pete admitted that he could never forget how it ended. "Time heals a lot of things," he said in a later interview. "But not that. Paul and I were never friends. I doubt we ever could be." Despite the passing decades, Pete Best's words about McCartney remained remarkably consistent. Even when he praised John Lennon's creativity or George Harrison's kindness, he drew a firm line with Paul. "John was wild. George was thoughtful," he once said. "But Paul was the one who always had to be in control. That's who he was then, and that's who he still is." It wasn't pure hatred, though, more a mix of pain and lingering mistrust. Pete admitted that he respected what McCartney achieved, but he could never separate that from what he lost. "I can't deny he's a genius," Pete said, "but geniuses can be ruthless, and Paul was ruthless with me." In the end, Pete Best's story and his feelings toward Paul McCartney became one of rock history's great emotional scars. The heartbreak of the man who almost had it all, and the resentment toward the friend who, in his eyes, made sure he didn't.